Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. It was the early 1980s. Thomas Hargrove lived in a small town nestled between trees on the northern coast of Oregon. The town was famous for its tranquility and nature. Most people came here to find peace and escape the hustle of life. Thomas was one of those people. The slow passage of time provided him with the perfect peace. Every morning, he had made it a habit to walk on the trails surrounded by trees outside the town. One morning, he woke up to the first light of a cool day, with dew resting on the soil. Normally, he would start his day with a cup of coffee, but that morning, he decided to begin the day with a walk into the depths of the forest. The weather was slightly cool, but it was a day he could comfortably walk with layers of clothing. That it had rained all night, and the forest smelled even fresher with the scent of fallen leaves and soil. He slowly opened the door to his house and stepped outside quietly. As he walked along the trail through the trees, he could hear the rustling of the leaves with every step and watched as the wind gently swayed the tree branches. Everything was peaceful. He had drifted into solitude, away from the noise and chaos of town life. The forest had always felt like a friend to him. It relaxed his soul and gave him peace. That morning, as he set off on his walk, he felt an inner peace, but at the same time, something was missing. It was a feeling that made him sense that something would change. But in that moment, he pushed the worry aside and let himself be absorbed by the sounds of nature. The feeling of being one with the forest always made him feel good. The rustling of every leaf, the chirping of every bird, the earth he felt with every step, all connected him to nature with a deeper bond. As he continued his walk, he became more lost in nature. The trees around him grew tall and thick, and the sky was covered with clouds. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting slender beams of light onto the ground. Thomas, as always, started walking further along the paths he had not yet explored. However, that morning was different. He realized that, until that moment, a feeling of being lost had emerged among the trails he had always known and walked. For years, everything seemed strangely unfamiliar in a way he had never felt before. Thomas walked for several hours, and the paths gradually narrowed, and the trees became more dense. He decided to turn back, but he was lost. Losing his way was something he had never thought about. He had been entering this forest and these trails for so many years without ever getting lost that he didn't immediately realize he had gone in the wrong direction. Amidst the sound of the wind, he felt as though he were trapped in silence. As the hours passed, he noticed the daylight beginning to fade. The sun had started to set, and the darkness of the forest was slowly creeping. And he didn't want to panic or admit he was lost, but deep inside, something was warning him. "I'm on the wrong path," he thought. But at that moment, he couldn't find any sign of it. His feet were tired, and his body was slowly wearing down. He took a few more steps, but the surrounding trees began to resemble a labyrinth, and he was becoming more and more isolated with each step. Eventually, darkness enveloped everything. At that moment, he felt like a man who had become lost in the depths of the forest, unable to escape from time. Everything around him felt like a reflection of the forest he knew, but it never felt real. All he could hear were the sounds of leaves, the whispering of the wind, and the distant calls of night birds. Thomas realized that the walk he had started that morning was the longest walk of his life, and he would never return. That evening, Thomas still hadn't come back. At first, his family thought he would return just as peacefully as he always did after his walks. Walking had always been a regular habit of his, and he never deviated from his plans. But as the hours passed and darkness began to fall, they sensed that something was wrong. Something had gone awry. Thomas's wife, Karen, had prepared dinner as usual by sunset. The early onset of darkness began to create a sense of unease in her. However, at first she didn't worry. She knew well Thomas's love for nature and his deep connection with the forest. He didn't always get lost. Even if he did, he should have been somewhere. But when it was time for dinner, and Karen didn't hear Thomas's voice at the door, she realized something was wrong. Karen thought about calling the trail Thomas had taken a few times, but soon, she received news from someone she knew in town. Another hiker had been out on the trails that day and hadn't seen Thomas at all. Panic began to set in. The townspeople, along with a few friends, decided to search the edges of the forest. A growing sense of fear began to settle in everyone's hearts. After several hours of searching, the townspeople encountered nothing but silence and darkness in the forest that evening. No sign of Thomas was found. The next day, the police got involved. The town was small, and everyone knew each other, so the disappearance of Thomas Hargrove had shaken everyone. In the days following that night, a large search operation was launched. Hundreds of volunteers combed every inch of the forest, but no matter how hard they searched, no clues were found. As the months passed, the mystery of the missing man deepened. The police, after their initial searches in the forest, couldn't find any concrete evidence. The place where Thomas had disappeared was so mercilessly covered by nature that no trace could be recorded. The months of searching proved unsuccessful. because Thomas had left no trace from the moment he disappeared. By that time, the townspeople had only seen the dazzling beauty of the forest, and Thomas's disappearance had carved itself into their minds like a nightmare. But with each passing day, the likelihood of finding the missing person grew smaller. As the days went by, his family and friends began to have a hard time believing that Thomas was truly lost. Karen tried hard to hold on to hope for as long as she could, but with each passing day, as she spent more time alone in the house, waiting for a man lost deep within the forest to return, it became harder and harder to bear. By September, the police decided to end all search operations. The forest remained silent, still holding its mystery. The day Thomas had disappeared, and the moment he vanished, nothing had changed since the town went back to its daily life. However, the townspeople continued to live with a feeling of emptiness ever since Thomas had disappeared. Many carried the void left behind by the missing man, but the main question remained: where had Thomas Hargrove really gone? Had he truly gotten lost, or had he left intentionally? As the years passed, the story of the missing man began to fade from the collective memory of the townspeople, although no one could really understand what his disappearance truly meant. Thomas's disappearance would remain one of the town's dark memories. No one could find any clues in the depths of nature or a disappearance forgotten by time. Still, there was always hope. Maybe one day, someone would find the traces of the lost man deep within the forest. Thomas Hargrove's disappearance had shaken the town. His disappearance was more than just the story of a missing man. It was the story of a lost part of a town and a community. At first, everyone held on to hope. In the days that followed, those who glanced at the newspapers in the mornings or watched the news about a missing man on the TV still felt something had gone wrong. But with each passing year, that feeling grew more and more faint. After Thomas's disappearance, Karen would open the window every morning as her first task, looking out at the town's roads, waiting for Thomas's familiar footsteps to return. But those footsteps never came. Gradually, staying alone at home in the mornings became the only way for her to cope with his absence. She felt as though she were in an empty space. Each morning she felt like she had lost the future she once shared with Thomas, and a growing emptiness took hold of her. In those first years, there was still hope that Thomas would return, but as time passed, that hope faded away. In the first year, the entire town came together, drawing closer in their efforts to find Thomas. Everyone had come together in the shared pursuit of finding the lost man. Even at the annual town festival, the townspeople, remembering the lost Thomas, shared their memories of him and made sure to highlight that he had never been forgotten. But with each passing year, the possibility of a missing person returning grew slimmer. For his family, time was also a struggle. For Karen, the house grew quieter with each passing day. Behind the happy moments of the old days, since the moment Thomas had disappeared, there had been a slow collapse. At first, Karen, who waited for Thomas at the same time every day, gradually began to let go of her daily waiting routine, which had become a habit over time. After a while, the townspeople also noticed that everything had been accepted. Thomas would remain a lost man, never to be found again. That lost man had now become a dream. As time passed, the town returned to its normal life. Just like a vanished star, Thomas's name gradually disappeared from the town's conversations, and then from the walls of the town itself. His disappearance became a dark, yet almost forgotten, page in the town's history. People stopped talking much about Thomas. The town had, almost like a dream, forgotten the story of the lost man. Several years after Thomas's disappearance, the town began to calm down. Talking about his disappearance no longer reminded anyone of the deep anxiety they once felt. His family, the townspeople, and his friends had accepted the return they had once hoped for. Everything was slowly erased, as if it were a dream. Karen's decision to move away from the town was a symbol of this acceptance. Every moment she spent alone at home reminded her of the pain she had lived through. And then, one day, in the quiet that the town had grown accustomed to, a phone call came. It was another reminder of a man who had disappeared, an event that had remained a distant memory in the town's history. But after all these years, nothing would ever be the same. Again, Thomas Hargrove had become a lost man in the town's memory, a man who would never return. Time had built a forgotten past, a past in which everything had been erased. Time had slowly healed the townspeople, and especially Thomas Hargrove's family, and had pushed them to get used to the lost past. 27 years had passed, and life, like in the town, continued. Karen, at some point, had come to feel that all these years since Thomas's disappearance had been nothing but a void. She lived a peaceful, yet silent life. Although the townspeople preserved the old memories, the fear and sense of loss left behind by Thomas's disappearance slowly faded away. They had to move on, and they did. That day, no one was expecting anything. No one thought that an old ghost would suddenly return after time had healed such deep wounds. It had been exactly 27 years since Thomas had disappeared. One morning, when Karen's phone rang, it signaled an event that would shake the town. At first, she didn't understand anything. An unfamiliar voice, speaking in a soft, high tone, was on the other end. Suddenly, the name of the man she had tried to forget, the man who had disappeared without a trace, hung in the air. "I'm Thomas, I'm back." When Karen heard these words, she couldn't believe her ears. To hear the voice of the man who had disappeared years ago, the man who had vanished without a trace and left her behind, was like everything had turned upside down. In that moment, the emptiness inside her suddenly swelled. The voice sounded so familiar that Karen immediately realized it was saying the right thing. "Thomas, is that you?" she asked. After a short silence, the voice replied again, "Yes, Karen, it's me, I'm here. I've come back." Karen realized, even if, for a moment, that she was facing something she couldn't have imagined. How had a man who had been lost for 27 years, who had left no trace, and never said a word to anyone, come back? It felt like a mystery. Slowly, tears replaced words. So much time had passed that Thomas's disappearance had become a legend. One could understand how this was even possible. After hanging up the phone, the news was spread to the townspeople. After years of Thomas's disappearance, one morning, the ghost of a dark past had returned. Like an old echo, resembling the sound of a river, it had returned. The return of a man who had disappeared without a trace, without any news for 27 years, was seen by the town as a legend. This wasn't just the return of a lost man, but the solution to one of the town's greatest mysteries. As Karen sat by the phone that morning, she could feel her heart pounding. Could Thomas have really come back? She and the townspeople had long wondered what the lost man had experienced in the depths of the forest, what secrets he had disappeared with. But now, Thomas was coming back. Almost every person in the town, like a shadow once lost, struggled to believe in this truth. That morning, Karen was shocked when something she had been waiting for finally happened. Someone who had been lost in the dark side of the past reappeared, blending back into life. This phone call would bring up a question that no one could explain. Where had Thomas Hargrove been for 27 years, and what had happened? No one could understand how it was possible for a man who had been lost for so many years to return. But in that moment, something began to stir in everyone. Something was about to change, because a man who had been lost had suddenly returned. When Thomas returned, he remained in a long silence before he started to explain anything to anyone. After 27 years, his return to the town was very different from what anyone had expected. His body was frail, but there was something changed in the depth of his eyes. He was very different from the old Thomas. The marks on his face told a story, hardened and full of pain, without hiding the struggles he had lived through. The years spent in the depths of the forest, a life full of loneliness, had transformed him both physically and mentally. At first, no matter how many times Karen asked him, Thomas resisted telling her anything. He had been alone for so many years, forced to live without telling anyone anything, and now finding the words for everything seemed difficult. However, one night, after a long walk, as they sat in an old house near the town, Thomas began to speak when Karen asked him a question. "When I got lost in the forest, I first focused on surviving," Thomas said, his voice carrying the echo of a dark past. "I started with the emptiness of losing something. I was alone. There were no people, no sounds, only nature. At one point, to survive, you had to understand nature. But it was also a form of inner discovery. No matter how alone you are, life somehow grows you again. You have to face yourself. Being alone was not just a physical fight, but a spiritual one." Karen was looking at him with deep suspicion and curiosity in her eyes. "But why didn't you return? Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. Thomas remained silent for a while. What was once a difficult question to answer now felt like a heavy burden. After a certain point, being alone becomes another kind of reality. The more isolated a person's mind becomes, the more their inner world expands. I had lost myself, but in a way, I had found myself within. This wasn't about returning to the outside world. It was an inner journey. I started to understand myself, and this inner discovery brought me a kind of peace. When I found myself, I didn't want to return to the outside world, because there, I wasn't alone anymore. I had made peace with myself. Karen saw such a great change in her husband's eyes that her love and fear for him intertwined. Thomas had discovered another form of existence beyond survival, within that deep loneliness, but the cost of this discovery had been immense. For 27 years, the man who had been lost had become a symbol of both mental and physical resistance in the depths of the forest. The other details Thomas began to share revealed the extent of the inner struggle he had experienced. At first, he had encountered the forest with fear, wild animals, the mysterious silence of the forest, the cold nights spent in the mountains, and hunger sometimes led him to despair. But somehow, he believed that everything was teaching him something. The cruelty of nature had shown him the real aspects of life. Understanding himself as a human being, while facing death and loneliness, and struggling to survive, gradually shaped him. At first, when I got lost, I was afraid, But then, one day, one morning, I woke up and said, I'm here. It took me some time to understand this. Being alone was actually an opportunity for a person to know themselves. But it also taught me how painful being alone could be. After those moments, I believed I had to be there. After a while, there was no point in going back. My inner journey had become more important than the outside world. But then, one day, something changed. I said to myself, I have to go back. Because people thought I was lost, but I had found myself in the depths of where I had disappeared. Karen saw the mixed emotions in his eyes. She still didn't fully understand the struggles Thomas had faced during the years he was lost. Only Thomas could teach her how a person could cope with loneliness, how someone could face nature and do whatever it took to survive. But at the same time, the journey he had made over the years had caused him to leave people behind and become trapped in a deep awareness of loneliness. Thomas had now emerged from the depths of the forest and his inner journey, but in every moment of his return, he not only found himself, but also the time he had been lost in and the identity that had disappeared with that time. Though he had returned to the town, the man lost in the silence of the past still carried the deep emptiness within him. Thomas Hargrove's return to the town was not just the finding of a missing person. It was the physical manifestation of a person's transformation. The journey of a man who had been lost for years, both external and internal, had become a symbol. The townspeople had a hard time recognizing the Thomas they once knew. When he returned, he was much different from the old Thomas. The deep scars on his face, the prominent muscles, the unfamiliar look in his eyes, everything had changed. That old man did not return to the town. Instead, there was a man who had merged with nature, who had survived, a different person. His return was not just a physical one. It was a kind of rebirth. The years spent in the forest had transformed him both mentally and physically. He had faced the wild power of nature and had become a man whose survival instincts were at their peak. Thomas's return to the town carried the marks of the loneliness and struggles he had endured during the years he was lost. Although he had returned, the townspeople had a hard time understanding his internal transformation. At first, everyone was waiting for the old, familiar Thomas. But in his place, there was almost a stranger who had emerged from the forest. The depth in his voice, the darkness in his eyes, were far removed from the cheerful, smiling man the townspeople once knew. Karen felt both joy and an odd sense of strangeness as her husband returned. She realized that the man she had once loved had turned into a stranger during the years he was lost. When Thomas returned to the town, he still hadn't adjusted to his old world. His speech, actions, and silence all showed that he remained a person who had been lost for years. Everything had changed, but somehow, the townspeople still wanted to rediscover his true identity. However, that lost man no longer existed. In his place was a man who had survived. As days passed, Thomas's time in the town gradually revealed his internal transformation. People tried to remember his old behavior and old mannerisms, but that old man had disappeared. Thomas had now become a man who had merged with nature for survival, so strong that his return began to teach the townspeople something. He had gone through not just a physical journey, but a spiritual one. As Thomas spent more time in the town, the effects of the years he had spent in the forest became more noticeable. A man who had been alone and fought for survival had gained his survival strength not only through physical ability, but also through his inner strength. Every day, as he walked through the town's streets, there was a certain awareness in his eyes. While the townspeople were still waiting for the return of the lost man, Thomas had left the thoughts and memories of that lost man behind. One evening, in the old town square, Thomas began to share with the townspeople for the first time the years he had spent in the forest. A silent crowd gathered around him, and Thomas shared the pain he had carried for so many years, how loneliness and the fight for survival had created an inner strength within him. As he spoke, he knew that what he was saying was true. The man who had been lost in the depths of the forest had, by the end of those years, transformed his lost identity into a story of self-discovery. I was alone, just me and nature. But I realized something, Thomas said, his voice deep and trembling. Being alone means not only facing the outside world but also facing the world inside yourself. When I was lost in the forest, I learned how to survive. But what being alone taught me was how much a person needs to be at peace with themselves. After Thomas's return, the townspeople began to see him not just as a lost man, but as a symbol of a journey. That lost man had not only been lost to the outside world, but also to his inner world. However, when he returned to the town, the townspeople began to accept him not as an old man but as a symbol of survival. He was no longer a lost man but a man who had survived. And as Thomas Hargrove returned from the depths of the forest, he had not only gone through a physical journey, but also a spiritual one.